Hey, it's EA for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to do a standard bind off on your Addi projects with a crochet hook. So let's get started. And so what we're going to do here is bind off with a crochet hook, which this is going to produce the basic standard bind off that is normally used in hand knitting. And all we're going to do here is see this last stitch that was knit here that's on the end of the waist yarn. I'm going to pull that off of the waist yarn, put it onto my crochet hook. Now because our rounds were knit in a clockwise method, it's going clockwise, the rows were knit clockwise, we have to bind off clockwise to make it continue around the edge of the fingerless glove. So what I'm going to do to bind off these stitches is I'm going to take my crochet hook, insert it into the next stitch on the waist yarn, and I'm starting at the new end of the waist yarn because here was the end of the round, this is the beginning of the round. So I'm just going to slip stitch through that stitch, and all you really need to do to work a slip stitch is you insert your hook into the next stitch, you put the yarn around the hook of your crochet hook and pull it through the stitch and the loop on your hook. And you want to do this fairly loosely because you don't want it to be too tight around the top of your hand. But the tension that you put on the yarn and how tight you do this will affect how tight the top of the fingerless glove is. So I'm basically just slip stitching through each stitch individually. If you're a crocheter, then you will be familiar with what I'm talking about. But if not, all you're doing is taking the crochet hook, inserting it into the next stitch, and pulling the yarn through both of those loops on your hook. And you just want to make sure that it's not too tight. You want to keep them even and somewhat loose so that they're not too tight. And this creates a great stable edge for any kind of knitting, particularly on the Addi, because you can't really do very many knitted on edgings on the Addi unless you work some sort of ribbing or stitch pattern of some sort. So I'm just going to continue with this bind off all the way around until I reach the other end, and then I'm going to show you how I join the two edges of the bind off together. Alright, so that's the last stitch. Since there aren't any more live stitches on the waist yarn, they're already been bound off, I'm just going to pull the waist yarn out, set it aside, and what we're going to do here to close up this little gap, and we want to make it seamless as possible, so I'm just going to cut the yarn, leaving about an 8 to 10 inch tail, just to have extra so we can weave it in. And you're going to pull on the loop that's on your hook until it just comes out. So all you have now is the yarn, the end of the yarn coming out through the last stitch you worked. Now you're going to take your yarn needle and put the end of the yarn that was on there through your yarn needle. And as you can see right here, this little loop was the first stitch that we picked up on our crochet hook off of the waist yarn. So that loop has kind of folded over to go onto the edge. So what we're going to do, if you look at this bound off edge, you can see that the loops just come out of the one before it. So the yarn is coming out of the loop we just made right here in that last bound off stitch. I'm going to insert my yarn needle under both sides, both strands of yarn that make up that first loop from the beginning of the bind off, and I'm going to run the yarn underneath those two strands of yarn, making that loop. So now we've recreated the first half of a loop. Now we're going to go back down where our yarn just was, right in the center of the last bound off stitch, like so. And we've just recreated the type of loop that we would have made if this has been a regular bound off stitch. But it's just kind of a a way to join the edges of this together. And as you can see, this is completely seamless. There is no jog here, there's no visible connection or anything. So now you're just going to weave in this end. And you also want to make sure that because the bind off is completely, the stretch in the edge of your bind off is completely dependent upon how tight you work it. So if you're making something like the fingerless glove that both gloves need to have the same amount of stretch, then you're just going to need to hold it up to the other one and measure it and make sure it matches before you tie off. So all I'm going to do here is make sure that the loop I just made to make the bind off seamless is at pretty much the same size as all the rest of them. I'm going to turn the fabric over, and I'm going to find a good spot to make a little knot just to secure it. And then you're just going to weave in that tail.